we talked about, or rather in Matthew chapter 11, we talked about this saying of Jesus. Come to me, all you who are weary and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Unfortunately, there's that chapter 12 marking. Because if we read chapter 12 without remembering chapter 11, we will kind of miss the whole context of what's going on in chapter 12. Notice again what Jesus says in verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. In the Old Testament, how is that word rest translated often? This is from Jeremiah 6:16. Let's go back and look. How is that word rest translated in the Old Testament? Sometimes it's translated with this word. I don't know how to say it in Hebrew, but Margot is what it looks like. But sometimes a synonym is used. This word rest is translated Sabbath, right? You'll have Sabbath. That's what it's been in Leviticus 23, if you'll remember. Rest, 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 rest. Don't do any work, don't do any work. It'll be a holy Sabbath. It'll be a holy rest. So, it's no coincidence that he says, you will find rest for your souls there. And now chapter 12, look what it's labeled, in my Bible at least. Sabbath questions about rest. So the answer is already given in chapter 11. Jesus is the rest. Someone can find rest, someone can find Sabbath in Christ. And remember the spiritual battle we talked about last week and how we can have rest from that battle by putting our confidence in Christ. So in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 1 he says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields. So at that time, at what time? Once he says this, he's about to demonstrate what he means, in a sense. So at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. It says your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath. Now, the controversy here in Matthew chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 is what constitutes doing no work on the Sabbath. If you go back to Leviticus 23, the passage we were in last Sunday morning, he told them in verse 3, you shall not do any work. It is the Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. And so the question becomes, what does it mean to not do any work? In the book of Acts, for instance, chapter 1, we see one of the things that they had done was come up with this measurement. They came up with this measurement of how far to travel. And do you remember what they called that? They called that a Sabbath day journey. Do you remember? And so in Acts chapter 1, they had gone out to the mountain, and it was about a Sabbath day journey out there. Acts chapter 1 and verse 12, a Sabbath day journey. So the Jews, in order to sort of determine what no work meant, they came up with all these rules, all these customs, traditions. Lonnie, did you have something? Oh, okay.
No, I had some on mine earlier, but I'll come back to it later. But
okay.
About the, I don't know, when you were saying that it came to my mind about in Hebrew when it said there remaineth no more rest for the people of God. That crossed my mind.
Right. There's we're definitely going to go to that. That's a good connection there to Hebrews chapter 4, right? That's right. Anybody else have something? Johnny?
That word they use that and how they define it or whatever it was.
Yeah, right.
I always took it to be for personal gain. When you out working doing something for personal gain, to prosper yourself.
Right.
Other than that, they were allowed to do certain things they were able to do.
Yeah, and that would have been one of the schools of thought. But some thought you couldn't even don't even lift a finger. From our perspective, reaching over and picking up the remote, that's work. So there's all these specific different schools of thought, and so what we have in with Matthew chapter 12 is Jesus interacting with some of these schools of thought, as we'll see in a moment. Lonnie?
John was talking, they crossed my mind about the young man that went out and picked up sticks on the Sabbath. What happened to him? You know, so I guess they looked at that to try to say you can't do nothing. You know, but the
Right.
no good deed, they were supposed to be able to do that because they were supposed to help a neighbor or anything else, the animals or whatever, within a ox, you know, a ditch or something like that, supposed to help them.
That's exactly right. Let's see. All right. So he says in verse 3, this is Jesus' response to their critique. Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone. Do you remember reading about this in Leviticus a couple weeks ago? I think it was Leviticus 21 and 22. And all those rules about the bread, all those rules about the meat. You can't eat this, you can't eat that. If those are in your house, they can eat it, but if it's a hired servant, he can't eat it. All this information there. And so what Jesus is saying in here in Matthew 12 and verse 3 and 4, that the purpose of that wasn't to mean that somebody would go hungry. You know, somebody had to go hungry because they couldn't eat that bread. But the purpose of that was to show forth who God was. Remember, it was all about the name, if you remember that text. It was all about the name of God. How do you show forth God's name? Do this, do this, do this, for I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Do this in my name. And so here what Jesus says is, whenever David ate that showbread that he wasn't supposed to eat under the law, he wasn't sinning in doing so. This wasn't an infraction of the old covenant. There is more grace there. We're actually going to see that, funny enough, today in our Leviticus class in Leviticus 24. In Leviticus 24, a situation comes up where they had never really seen it before, and they hadn't received any command for it, so they got to figure out what to do. Here in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 3 and 4, Jesus presents this situation where in normal circumstances, this would be a sin. If David just said, I'm going to go eat the showbread today. But since he was hungry, and since, they didn't have, they needed some type of sustenance, it was okay for them in that moment to eat that bread.
Did anybody ever do any research on that particular incident and what was going on at the time? Why was David hungry? Why was David, those with him? They make mention of those that was with him. What was going on? That David.
Yeah, and
David was fleeing, and then later on, we need to remember what happened to those priests with Saul too. He killed them.
And
He allowed that to happen to that priest, but they were supposed to help David, and they told the priest something. I forgot what it was.
And
David said, I forgot what it was.
yeah, in 1 Samuel,
allowed to eat it.
right, in 1 Samuel chapter 20, David had just spoken with Jonathan, and they're trying to, get him out safely. And so in chapter 21, David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you. And I've directed the young man to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found." The priest answered David and said, "There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest and said to him, "Surely women have been kept from us as previously, when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priests gave them consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Now, so in this situation, they're trying to get regular bread, And the priest says, well, all we have is this holy bread. And so David says, well, that'll do. And Jesus says that was perfectly okay in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 3 and 4. Now, let's see how this might compare to today's world. Okay, we have this situation, and in every circumstance imaginable, it's wrong to eat this bread, except in this one. In this one, it's okay because there is no other bread. He needs something. He's been sent by Jonathan. He's got to have something, and so the priest and David both agree. In this situation, it's okay. In this situation, the rules don't apply. It's okay for you to have this bread. Now, let's say that somebody has broken into your house, and you've stepped out to defend your family, and the man says, is there anybody else here besides you? What do you say? Everybody's cowering in the closet. What do you tell them? Do what, Ashley?
It depends. Some people would say yeah, and some would say no.
Right.
Depends on the person.
What do you well, all right. Is it wrong for you to say, nope, I'm the only one here tonight?
Well, it's a lie.
I would say it's wrong, but I don't see nothing wrong with saying it. Ain't nobody here.
Well, right. In situations, it's wrong to lie. You don't want to cheat somebody out of something.
Right.
But in Matthew 12, verse 3 and 4, we have a precedent that in terms of intense hunger, it was okay for them to eat the showbread if there's nothing else available for them to eat. And I would argue that if someone is coming into your house to try to kill you and your family, and you say, well, my family's out of town tonight, you have me instead, I don't know if you're going to be sent, to eternal hell or something like that because of that. What do you think, Johnny? You got something to say?
But not to be sent to hell for it.
Right.
Obviously, all liars, have their part. That's a lie.
That's true. And
so you're doing what's safest for your family. Not saying that you're right or wrong. You're doing what you want to do at that time. But still, you have to look at the scripture and what the scripture says.
Yeah, that's right. And in this,
there's a precedence. I mean, when Abraham was in Egypt and Pharaoh took Sarah, he came up with something that wasn't what we would call quite true. When he asked him, he said that Sarah was his sister, and he did that because, and he later on reiterated because he didn't want Pharaoh to take her by force and destroy him and what he had. It was a lie, but you don't see where he was condemned or.
Well, it did cause him a bunch of trouble.
It caused, that particular one, it caused him some trouble. Now, I don't know if it caused him any trouble, it caused Pharaoh some trouble.
Right.
It didn't cause him any trouble because God said, I'm going to bless you, bless those that bless you, and I'm going to curse those that curse you. Anybody come up against you, raise a hand against you, I'm going to fight against them. So that, in a sense, Pharaoh, because of what Abraham told him and Pharaoh's actions, God fought against Pharaoh. So, you can take that either way. It depends on what your reasoning is about.
Right.
What was it that you were trying to accomplish?
Let me share this with you. They shall not profane the holy gifts of the sons of Israel, which they offer to the Lord, and so cause them to bear punishment for guilt by eating their holy gifts, for I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Scripture's clear. You're not supposed to eat the holy bread if you're not from the tribe of Levi. It's not for you. But in that situation, David was allowed to eat it. So there's my argument. The Bible's clear that lying is wrong.
Right. It's the purpose. What was David? David was doing something working in the ranks of God. I mean, working for God, doing what God wanted to do.
Right.
And his men were part of that job that he was doing. There was no other bread, so there is space to where things can be worked out. I mean, things are not just cut and dry all the time.
Right. Jimmy, then Lonnie.
Did Rahab lie?
She did.
Was
But
she found good?
well, James 2 doesn't say she was found good for lying. James 2 said she was found good for keeping in the spies, is what we've always said. But
But she saved people's
That was
lives.
a lie, though.
right. No, I know. I was just giving the stock
She
answer.
saved people's lives, correct?
Right.
Because of her lie.
That's right.
I
I think our Lord is not going to have a problem if somebody's trying to kill our family, and we say, no, they're not in there, they're at 7-Eleven.
But I'm not going to tell you which 7-Eleven.
I think that's kind of an absurd thing.
We miss a few points. It's just that if a person's alive, you know, they have a chance to work it out. And the Bible teaches that God is sorrow. Person, think about what they did, but the reason they did it, they could repent of it later. You know what I'm talking about? At this moment, you're doing it for the sake of somebody. But when you think about it later, you realize I lied, and you could go to God and ask for forgiveness for that in a sense too. Because this is God is sorrow for working with repentance. And every time we do something wrong, we need to straighten it up too. You know.
Right.
And, no, but I said I think it's wrong, but it was right to do it. You know. That was my stand, and that's my opinion. It's not God's word.
Yeah, sure. And just right here, he says, the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor those with him.
Right.
But God excused him in that moment. Robert, then Lillian.
Well, it says, my grace is sufficient and covers all. So, here again, we're wrestling with something that we might not be able to understand all the intricate parts. I know some people have spoken today about the intent of the person's heart and then the act itself and the great good behind it. All that has a part to play in this earthly piece that we have, but yet still, it says, my grace is sufficient, covers all. So, in there lies some answer and some relief to us when we find ourselves in those kind of situations.
Yeah, and so it comes down to, are you walking in the light or are you not? What are you trying to accomplish? What's your intent? What's your purpose? What you have your mind set on?
Right.
Lillian?
I thought about what Linda said about if you lie, you may have time to straighten it out afterwards. But you may, what's that guy and his wife, Safari, whatever, they were killed right on the spot. They didn't have time to change nothing or try to get nothing straight.
Right.
So you may not have time.
Yeah, in that situation, they weren't even right. They were doing something intentionally wrong and shady.
Right, they reversed that thing, remember? They got together on that to lie. They already had agreed to make that lie. That's what they're reading.
Right.
A person in a situation like that don't have a chance to think.
Right.
We should always sit down and consider our actions and what we're about to do, what we engage ourselves in. Too often we do it and we think we're doing it for a good reason, but then when we really examine it, we're not. But when you do something that is wrong and you do it for a completely selfless reason, try to protect somebody, as you said, somebody coming into your home gonna try to hurt your family or try to hurt you and your family.
Right.
You make a hard decision to either say, yeah, they're here or they're not. But I'm saying, as far as your conscience is concerned about the law of God, but to a lot of us, it's not a hard decision at all. What man that loves his family, loves his children, loves his wife, love anybody that's in the home would hand them over to somebody that is intending to hurt? You would say no, they're not there. I would hope. I mean, I hope your wife and your children.
Yeah, right. Or you would say yes.
Oh, yeah, they're in the closet. Go ahead. Yeah.
Or you say yes, they are there, but I got something back here too. So.
But,
right.
It's a decision. I mean, I believe like when I said you have to consider it, and when you have opportunity, you correct that. But
I think it was Johnny, then Robert.
Going back to what Keith said about Abraham and Sarah, looking at deceiving and lying, what we're going to look at, they would be in the same thing of deceiving, trying to make someone believe something different than what it actually is.
Right.
But when Abraham said that was his sister, he came back and said it really wasn't his sister. It wasn't. It was his sister from the mother's side, from the father's side, but not the mother's side.
And the
Deceiving him to make him think that hey, okay, right, this is right.
and the king wasn't happy about that, or Pharaoh wasn't happy about that, was he? He's pretty upset. He said you should have just told me the truth from the beginning. But
you can take it. You take something and you can reach as far as you want to reach with it. While technically what Johnny said is correct, but I can say that if someone asks me about that, is that my wife? I can say, no, that's my sister too. If God said He took from one blood, all men come. So we're all brothers and sisters.
Right.
Technically, but that's not what was. That's skirting around or going around what was really asked.
Yeah, that's like when Laura asked me, "Did you do the dishes?" She's calling me. I said, "Well, yeah, I've done the dishes many times." But hang on, let me go do them real quick while you're on the way home. But that's obviously not the truth. Right, exactly. Let's see. I forgot where I was. Robert.
Just that the concept that God knew that law was hard. It's hard, almost next to impossible. And all of the laws can put us in situations such as these that contradict what we should do. So there came on the scene grace. I still feel that our mercies in that. And we talked about, I think last Sunday or Sunday before, about being righteous and walking in the Word. We're still going to make mistakes. So there are going to be times where you do make mistakes, but it's your intent that you should follow, and that the grace, we live in grace.
Yes, here's a point to take from that real quick. In Matthew 11, remember Jesus said, my burden is easy, right? My yoke is easy, my burden is light. You'll find rest for your souls. So think about this question that David asked the priest. He said, surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. In other words, these young men were holy on an ordinary journey. How much more than today will their vessels be holy on this sacred journey, right? So in Matthew chapter 12, the question could be asked: if God was willing to be merciful to David, to allow some gray area here in eating the showbread, how much more today will He be merciful to us, those who are not living under law but living under grace? Lonnie?
That was one thing I'm thinking about. It's the condition of our mind. If we exercise our mind to do what's right, and at this moment, we normally do things that are right, but at this moment, if we said something wrong, do something wrong, I think it's something God would allow certain things. Like, for instance, what you just said then, because God knows the heart of a man, you know what I'm talking about? And no, you don't have that intention to just lie bluntly, but you do.
Right, that situation is not saying that lying is. Here's a rule. That situation is not saying that lying is always acceptable. All right, here's a rule for you to remember in life. Let's see. We cannot make rules based on outliers. Anybody know what an outlier is? It's what? No. Yeah, like an extreme. Like look at this set of data. Let's say the kid makes these test scores. One day the kid makes an 88. The next day he makes an 80. Maybe one day he makes a 92. Maybe he makes an 85. Then all of a sudden the kid makes a 53. All right. That 53 is an outlier. That 53 makes the teacher go, okay, wait a minute. Something's not right here. Something's going on at the house. Something's going on with the lesson. Maybe the test was too difficult. Maybe I need to rethink that. But when a kid does that kind of thing, then you start to say something's wrong here. Right. Or it's like when you measure the average of your tire pressure, right? And your tire pressure average, is always one thing, and then one day it's a little bit low. Now you know, okay, something's wrong. I got to investigate, right? Has the weather changed at all? Is there something actually stuck my tire? What's going on? And so we can't base. David ate showbread when he was hungry. Therefore, it's always right to eat the showbread. So that's not what he's saying. And that's what some people try to do, though. Some people try to say, okay, in that situation it's okay. That means it's always okay. Like here's a case in point: the thief on the cross. The thief on the cross was not. He wasn't living after Jesus' resurrection. He was living prior to Jesus' death and resurrection. Prior to Jesus' resurrection. So the question about whether or not the thief should have been baptized or not baptized, or was he or wasn't he, doesn't really make sense, because that's an outlying situation. How many of us are on our deathbed, right? all of us here have been given ample opportunity to, respond to Jesus in belief, repentance, confession, and baptism, right? And so to try to establish a rule based on an outlying situation doesn't make any sense. We have to look at the average of the data, not these outliers, whenever we're trying to interpret Scripture and see what God's plan for us is.
That's like life. Like a mother know her child, I said mother, but anybody, and know someone, and all of a sudden they are acting different.
Right.
That's out of the norm. You say, what's wrong?
Yeah.
Is something wrong? When the person starts acting or doing something that is not normal for that person, you know something is wrong.
Right, and so if the kid is always doing good, always trying to do good, messes up every now and then, but then he goes through this really bad streak, yeah, now you know something's up, something's going on that's not right. All right, here's a word that you might be. Let's keep going on this lying thing for just one more few seconds here. Anybody familiar with this term, bluff? Anybody know what a bluff is?
I know the bluff, I know.
Do what?
I know the bluff, I know too.
Oh yeah, right. So what's
Bluff is somebody trying to tell you something.
all right?
Trying to tell you something that they really don't know, but they're kind of like leading you to believe that they know it. They're bluffing. They're like
Now, what about in that context? Texas Hold'em. All right, now I don't.
All those terms come in cards, like, but
Yeah, that's right.
you got different things, when you words carry different meanings at different times.
Right. Now, so if you're playing cards with somebody, and you're not like, we're not talking about playing for money. We're talking about playing for fun. You got all the chips out on the table, and you go all in, and all you have is a 7-2 offsuit, right? You're bluffing, right? That's what we call it, a bluff.
Right.
Now, God isn't up there going, he's lying in that card game right there. We got him. Write that down, Michael. Because that's not a situation where everybody expects you to lie. Like when I show Cherish a magic trick, I basically am telling Cherish, I'm about to lie to you about where this coin is, right? And then she finds enjoyment out of that, and she likes that. Lying is something that's done with ill intent to try to either save your own skin or cheat somebody out of something, to put yourself up for an advantage. All right, Matthew 12, verse 5 and 5 through 7. Or have you not, let me scroll down a little bit for you. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? In other words, they're working on the Sabbath.
Right.
But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. You could also say that something greater than the showbread is here. Because remember, Jesus in John chapter 6 said, they gave to you physical bread, I give to you the bread of life. You eat from it, you'll never die. Talking about his spiritual life we have in him. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. He's not just talking about him and his disciples. He's talking about all these people that the Pharisees have been condemning. All these people that Jesus has been ministering to that have been rejected and outcast because of the Pharisees' strict guidelines. So in Matthew chapter 12, we see that grace existed even under the law. And one of the things that he points out here again, something greater than the temple is here. So if God was willing to be gracious even in the old covenant, certainly he is much more even in the new. Lonnie?
That's something that we got to remember. If we put in charge of something, there are rules, what I'm talking about?
Right.
And we got to realize that rule is there. But the point is, where does it end and where does it begin? There got to be some mercy, love, and there got to be some justice behind that rule.
Right.
There's sometimes when a person you got a rule, and a person may do something wrong. Even if you go to court, sometimes there's lenient. Sometimes if a person do something without knowledge, you got to consider the facts that come up in that, making that decision, that how much that person knew what they were doing and stuff like that.
Right. Some people lie unintentionally.
Right.
Just based on information that they have.
Right.
They're not trying to, but they do it on accident.
That's
Right. Well, it's like if somebody really believes that something happened and they tell you that it happened, you know, they're not lying to you. They think that's actually, they think that's what they're. So, you know, that's they're not being dishonest, but they're lying. Does that make sense? Because you can be a dishonest person, right? But you can tell a lie without being an inherently dishonest person. All right. Anyways, let's keep going. Well, let's see. Actually, we got a few minutes here. So verse 7, he says, "But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion, or I desire mercy, and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." This kind of goes back to what we've been talking about in Leviticus. All these sacrifices and rituals and feast days and customs, those weren't the purpose of the law. Like, those weren't the end goal. The end goal was to develop in Israel a kind and a peaceful and a thoughtful and a merciful spirit. As he says here, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He didn't want them just to say, you know, this whole thing is about offering up sacrifices. He wanted that to make them better people and more conscious of those around them. So here's what he's saying about this now. The purpose of the Sabbath and the purpose of that showbread wasn't the Sabbath and the showbread, but was to reflect something greater about who God is and who we ought to be and how we ought to treat others. And so that's what he says in Matthew 12 and verse 7. If you'd understood that the law wasn't the goal of the law was to get you to be a certain way, to treat others a certain way, then you would never have condemned the innocent. You would have been more patient with others and been, a little bit more thoughtful of others. Let's see. Lonnie?
It's a lot of times people realize what the first thing that man said, but they don't realize the other teaching that went with the first thing that was said. All through the Pentateuch, you can see that love, God is constantly adding more to those first principles.
That's right. Even through the prophets and through the teachings of David and some others, there's things that are being added in there. That's right. Let's see. Matthew 12 and verse 8. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. It's kind of an interesting phrase, isn't it?
It kind of makes everything else, brings everything else in perspective. Look back at the whole context that we've been wrestling with, starting above 7, and then in 7 and 8, it kind of just tells you that I am the rule maker. When you're trying to be the rule maker, you're setting these standards, or you're trying to understand my rules.
Right.
I'm still a rule maker.
Yeah, he's saying you saying I break the rules when I'm the one that made the rules, right? All right. Hey, if anybody knows the game, he does, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so departing from there, he went into their synagogue. So now all this is in the context of Jesus saying, I will give you rest. I will give you Sabbath. In fact, I wonder, what's the New Testament? Okay. All right. From there he went into the synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, asking, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they keep asking him all these questions. First they accuse him about the grain, now they're accusing him about this, so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, what man is there among you who has a sheep? Your version may say, or in some passages it says who has an ox, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So so what he's saying is, if the work that you're doing is good, it's lawful to do that. Kind of like the priest working in the temple on the Sabbath. That's okay. If you're going to pick up your sheep, that's okay. If you're going to help out somebody, that's okay, right? If your grandma falls and you got to pick her up, that's not working on the Sabbath. That's not what he meant. He says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now in verse 13 he says, or rather he says to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. Have you ever met with such a group of people who never can be pleased like that? No matter what Jesus is doing, no matter what good he's doing, everybody's just, all these Pharisees are doing all they can to just destroy him and mess him up. Ashley? That's right. In Acts chapter 10, that's what Peter had to decide. Cornelius said about Peter in Acts chapter 10, I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. Remember what Peter said? It's not lawful for me to be here, right? And he says, you've been kind enough to come. And so there's a sense there in that passage where someone looks at the custom of the day and they say, well, I'm going to break this custom because this is a human. I need to, I'm supposed to do good unto them as God has done unto me. I'm supposed to treat them more valuable than sheep, right? And so Peter goes where God wanted him to go, even though in the custom of the day as a Jew, it was unlawful for him to do that. All right. Okay, let's look at Matthew chapter 12 and verse 15. So Jesus was aware of this and withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all, and warned them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. Behold my servant who I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A battered reed he will not break off, and a smoldering wick he will not put out, until he leads justice to victory. And in his name the Gentiles will hope. This passage from Isaiah is quoted from somewhere else in the New Testament. Does anybody know where? Luke 4:8. Yeah, Luke 4:18. Jesus quotes this passage, and what did they do? Do you remember when he quoted that to them?
How's it read in the King James Version?
How's it
read in the King James Version?
Let's see. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to preach the good news of the gospel. King James, let's see. What passage did I say? Luke 4 what? 18? He says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. Does anyone remember what happens after Jesus delivers that sermon? What do they try to do?
They tried to kill him.
Yeah, they try to throw him off a cliff.
Yep.
And so here in Matthew chapter 12, this same passage is quoted again to talk about Jesus' ministry. All right, next week we're going to get into this demon-possessed man, but I do want to show you one thing about it. What they did here, Jesus calls speaking evil against, or blasphemy. Therefore I say to you, any sin and blasphemy shall be forgiven people, but blasphemy against the Spirit shall not be forgiven. So, interestingly enough, in our class on Leviticus in a few moments, we're going to be talking about blasphemy. And so that'll be good. All right, it's 10:20, so we'll stop there and take a break for about 10 minutes.